Hello, everybody. My name is Roth, and I'm going to be talking about Mycelium, which is joint work with Karan, Newatia, Yiping, Zhong, Sebastian Angel, and Andreas Haeberlen. I'm going to start with a scenario which, unfortunately, we are all a bit too familiar with, which is tracking the spread of COVID-19 through a network of people. Now, the medical community had lots of questions about exactly how this spreads, for instance, the effect of certain locations or risky behaviors. One toy question we could ask is seeing if an infected person goes to two restaurants, how many people become infected at both those places. So in both these, I have histograms which show what an answer might look like. Now, answering this kind of question is hard to do in controlled studies, even at very small scales. And in this case, we're actually dealing with a massive scale. However, one good thing about that is that all of the necessary data happens to already be on our phones, as part of efforts like Google and Apple's exposure notification system. Now, these contact tracing systems are designed to notify people when they may have come in contact with an infection. However, analyzing this in any sort of central way is extremely difficult because this is very sensitive data. It not only contains things about health and location, but also might reveal information about our connections to others. So one tool we have in our toolbox is differential privacy. This guarantees that the output of queries doesn't leak much information about participating users. As an example, if we answer the same query twice, once with data that includes Bob and once with data that doesn't, this exactly leaks Bob's input from this missing bit in the histogram at this point. So differential privacy protects against the scenario by adding a little bit of imprecision to the answer. So in this case, it adds some randomness to this histogram and also adds randomness here. So at this one point on 5, drawing error bars here to show that it's difficult to tell what Bob's input actually may have been. So one thing differential privacy doesn't tell us how to do, though, is actually compute these outputs in a way that doesn't jeopardize privacy. So let's say that we upload all the data in the clear to some central aggregator. So we have all these users uploading this data, where the aggregator then does this differentially private noise addition and get some error bars here. So this would work, but it's really hard in practice to find any entity that can be trusted with this sensitive data. This is one massive single point of failure. Fortunately, there already is a system that helps solve this problem. So our previous work, Orchard, as well as Honeycrisp, gives a solution that doesn't force us to put trust in any party. These systems are good at answering queries that can be boiled down to adding vectors of per user data. So for instance, the number of people who type the word mycelium today. These systems support a wide variety of machine learning queries, but if we want to answer this question about our pizza place, there are some issues that arise. So in this case, the data isn't nicely broken down by users. So to find the histogram for pizza places, we would have to find the other users that our infected user Alice came close to while she was there, and then figure out how many of them were diagnosed with COVID shortly afterwards. And this isn't something that Alice's phone can know by itself because the diagnosis would happen much later. So rather, we need to do some sort of complex computation over an entire graph. And if we do that, we also need to prevent the aggregator from learning that graph, which is sensitive too, and in the process, make sure that participants don't learn their neighbor's sensitive data. So this histogram query one answered actually has a two-part structure. It computes some kind of statistic for each user based on that user's neighborhood in the graph, and then it aggregates that statistic across the entire user base. This is good news because Orchard is already good at sums. And in our survey of medical literature on infectious diseases, we found that this two-part structure was actually quite common. So hypothetically for now, let's look at this pizza place. Now Alice's phone knows who she was close to in the pizza place. So if she could somehow ask these people whether they were subsequently diagnosed with COVID, she could compute some local histogram for herself. So here she's asking her neighbors, Bob and Charlie both report a 1 bit because they're both infected, and Dana reports a bit of 0. So Alice can just sum these up. And now if everybody in the system did this, we could just sum it up to get our final answer. This immediately raises two problems though. So one, how can Alice do this without learning the infection status of her neighbors, which is private? And two, how can she even talk to them? So the exposure notification system uses pseudonyms for one, and she won't be in communication range anymore by the time they're diagnosed. So I'm gonna get into this in a second, but the key insight here is that many queries fit this two-step structure. So now to get into communication, how are we gonna do this? Again, infection is often revealed much after initial contact, and we only have pseudonyms to work off of. So in this case, I have these pseudonyms here. The devices aren't gonna have the necessary information when they're in actual range at the time. So say that Alice wants to send a message X to Bob. One naive solution we could do is route through the central aggregator. They could maintain mailboxes for each individual. So Alice might send up this X to the mailbox, and then Bob would just go and retrieve the message. But in this case, the aggregator exactly learns who was close to whom, which is sensitive information. All right, so let's try something else. We could still use the aggregator as an untrusted mediator, but route through a chain of users using onion encryption. So this might look something like this. I'm adding 2 additional mailboxes. And Alice is going to encrypt her X with layers of encryption. She's going to put this into Charlie's box, who's going to download this and remove 1 layer. And this will happen until we reach the final node in the destination. So Bob eventually gets X after 3 layers of encryption are stripped off. However, the aggregator can still track this single path. So what do we actually do in Orchard? We have a small set of participating devices act as intermediary mixes. And we're going to use the same mailbox and onion encryption scheme. I'm not actually going to show the encryption in this image, but keep in mind this all happened throughout this. So we have many messages being sent at once. So I'm adding 3 additional senders and 3 additional recipients. What's going to happen is these messages are going to be sent, and each running node downloads their stack of messages, of which there will be many. They're going to decrypt 1 layer and upload their messages to the next hop. So in this, for example, Elliot and Charlie each have 2 messages. And importantly, when they're going to send these out, the aggregator can't see which input message corresponds to which output. In this case, these are the way that these were shuffled. And then this is going to continue until the destinations receive their messages. This is basically a mixnet, except that we're using the aggregator as an intermediary. This leads to some interesting technical challenges, for instance, during path setup that we discussed in the paper. But this is the key insight, is the semi-centralized mixed network. So we know how to do the local part of each query is communicated through the mixnet. But in this scenario, Alice still can learn the infection status of her neighbors through communication. We fix this with fully homomorphic encryption, which looks something like this. Each individual who is next to Alice is going to send an encrypted bit, and she's going to sum these up to support her local histogram. This is more subtle than it may sound. So because of limitations with current FHE schemes, we had to come up with a special encoding to make this practical. So in practice, these are polynomials, but more about that is in the paper. All the global aggregator has to do at this point is just add up the ciphertext, roughly analogous to what happens in Orchard. And this is the 3rd key insight of the paper. So now to put it together, let's look at both our places, the pizza place and the burger place. So Alice is going to communicate with her neighbor, and she's going to get a 1 because she has 1 infected neighbor. The same thing is going to happen all across the graph at the pizza place. So every individual is going to create some local histogram based on the number of users that they infected. They're going to send these to the central aggregator in encrypted fashion, who sums them all up and gets this histogram. Then this exact same process is going to happen at the burger place, and this all gets aggregated. Finally, we're going to add a little bit of noise and get the slightly imprecise final histograms. So basically, because less infections spread there, this proves that pizza is far superior to burgers, but also gives an overview of how the system functions as a whole. So now that I've told you how Mycelium works, I'm going to talk about how we evaluated it. There are lots of questions we wanted to ask in the paper. I'm only going to briefly touch on a few, so I encourage you to check out our full evaluation section in the paper. The first thing that we wanted to look at was generality. So we surveyed the medical literature on queries about infectious diseases and picked a collection of representative queries. Now, of the queries we've collected, we can support almost all, except one, which is due to the limitations of the specific FHE scheme we used. We next wanted to estimate costs for up to 1 billion devices for how our system would function. Most of the costs are roughly linear in the number of users, with the small logarithmic factor in the mix. For users, there's almost no dependency on the total number of participants. Now, for instance, the amount of computation the aggregator would need is going to be shown here. The number of participants on up to 1 billion is on the x-axis, and computation in cores is on the y-axis. And the aggregator will have access to a data center, so these are costs that should be able to be handled with this linear trend. Some average costs here as follows for the average participants and for the aggregator per device. The takeaway here is that we can scale up to 1 billion devices. So I'm going to leave you with the summary. We were tackling graph queries at massive scale in this untrusted setting. We built Mycelium, which processes differentially private queries on the scale up to 1 billion users using these 3 key insights. We support many queries and scale roughly linearly in the number of total users. So I'm happy to take any questions and thank you for your time.